How we feeling? Exam 1's in the rearview mirror. Okay, so a couple of things to talk through. It's actually like a win-win. That's a win-win-win. Let me explain. So if you did really well on exam 1, that's obvious, it's a win. If you did mediocre, but you got the bonus opportunities and you're in a spot where you're like, well, wasn't what I really wanted, but it's not horrible, I passed. I'm going to improve from here. Not sure I'm going to drop this one. Time will tell. Still not a bad place to be. If you're in the situation where you're like, wow, that was a shocker, wasn't expecting that, probably going to be dropping that exam, and you used your freebie, well, you're still not in a horrible situation. Okay, so win-win-win, the way I see it. Challenging class can be difficult material. Again, we talked about it. Much of what we saw in the beginning was review, and then we talked about histology and tissues, which was new. But many of you, it was a long time, or it was actually the first time you saw the review material. So could have been a really challenging exam. 5 exams in this class. You have a lot of other points outside the exams, like the quizzes, the participation activities, even the bonus opportunities. So now you have less anxiety, hopefully, about what is the exam going to look like. And sometimes that's more than half of the issue, is trying to understand, like, what's the question going to look like. Fair? That being said, I'm actually really proud of you all because the average was a 74. And then if you add the bonus, the average was an 80. And so the next obvious question that someone's going to ask is, well, are you going to round down or curve down the class? Like if the average is a little high? No. Straight scale, just like we talked about the first day of class. Some of your colleagues did extremely well, and the way you read your exam 1 total score is that column that says exam 1 total, and then it's going to say exam 1 plus BA1, bonus assignment 1, and it gives a score. That should be your exam 1 raw score plus your bonus opportunity. Some of your colleagues scored more than 100% on exam 1 if you take the totals together. So there's a little buffer there for some of you. Does that make sense? How the bonus opportunities work? You can expect a bonus opportunity every unit or every exam. The number of points of bonus may fluctuate, will fluctuate. It won't always be 8, but you can have something knowing going into the exam what kind of cushion you have. Okay? All right. No quizzes this week. You have this, you had an exam on Monday. You have a new lecture on Wednesday. I thought, let's have a little bit of a restful week at the end. So no quizzes this week. Really like you to stay on the material. Look at chapter 5 this week if you haven't read it yet. It's actually a pretty good chapter. I'm going to read a few interesting facts from the chapter that I thought were kind of apropos for what we're talking about. And we'll finish up skin or integument on Monday. Okay, so it's for us, it's a little bit of a sigh, right? Like I'm really happy to see all of you here after an exam because you don't want to fall behind on the material. We have all new material today. We'll bridge the weekend. We'll finish it on Monday, chapter 5. You can read it, but there's no quiz, no assignment due this week. We have SI sessions that are running as scheduled. So it's a great opportunity but there's no participation points this week. Those will come later. Okay? So you just to sit back, relax, and enjoy skin. That sounds weird, huh? What did the firefly say to his girlfriend? You light up my world. I like that. You look simply glorious. What goes all the way around a baseball field but never moves? What goes all the way around a baseball field but never moves? The fence. Nicely done. When is the only time you go on red and stop on green? Go on red, stop on green? When you're eating watermelon. You guys get it? Okay, lab this week. What are you guys talking about in lab this week? Skin, integument. Okay, so we're on track with each other. A couple of really interesting facts from your textbook, right in the beginning of the textbook, chapter 5. The skin of an average human covers approximately 2 square meters. For those of you that are metrically challenged, that's about 2 square yards. And can weigh 22.5 pounds. That's how much your skin weighs. The turnover in your skin. Your textbook says the skin you see on the surface of your body will be brand new in about a month. And so let me qualify that a little bit. It's sort of true for young individuals like maybe 13 to 18-year-olds. Turnover is about 4 to 5 weeks. In infants, it's even faster, but as you age, that slows down. And in geriatric populations, it could take as much as 3 months for skin to turn over. So we're going to talk about wound healing today. Well, actually, we won't cover wound healing today. We'll cover it Monday. But you all know when you get a cut on your skin, it heals. So it may take anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months. And of course, if the patient has some underlying issue, it's going to take longer. Age is a pathology, so the older you get, that impacts the healing process. So it's kind of a true statement in the textbook. It's not really wrong, but I wanted to give you a little color. So it says about a month. That's probably on average accurate for this classroom. And bacteria that live on your skin outnumber your own cells 10 to 1. And there may be up to 1,000 different species of bacteria living on your skin, which is very factual. Like all of us have fingerprints, right, that are unique. You actually have a microbiome on your skin of bacteria that's unique to you, as unique as a fingerprint is. Think about that for a second. The bugs that live on your skin are your bugs. Some of you are like shifting in your seat and you want to find an empty seat with some buffer between you and the person next to you. Well, don't look at those seats too carefully because they're pretty worn out. So there's been a lot of prior students in them. I saw those on the exam day when I was circulating around. Skin cancer is the most common cancer in the United States with about 9,500 new diagnoses each day. And here in the Southwest, skin cancer is a huge deal. So there's a whole bunch of more facts or little tidbits in the textbook just on interesting facts. But I actually thought many of those would be really interesting to share just to kind of kick off the integument. This is actually one of my favorite systems in the body. Upper left, what is that a picture of? What is it? Hair follicle. Leaving the skin. So the integument, or the skin, is a term or a word. Integument means covering. It literally translates to covering. It's from the Latin root word integrare, which means to cover. So that's where it got its name from. The components of the skin include a cutaneous membrane that we'll study in great detail. We have all sorts of different glands, hairs, hair follicles, nails, and various types of tissue that compose skin. Epidermal tissue, as well as dermal tissue, including connective tissue, like what we just studied. It is the largest organ in the body. It's also the one that you can see visibly. So it's easy to appreciate things that change in this organ. It's very weird, I think, for a lot of students to think of the skin as an organ, but that's exactly what it is. Because by definition, an organ is multiple tissues that come together to serve different functions, right? So we'll see different functions of like the epidermis as well as the dermis, the two main components of skin. So why is it called an organ? Because it serves multiple purposes made up of tissues. Those tissues are made up of cells. And contrary to probably public opinion, the skin functions far more than just keeping stuff inside of you, right? So we'll get to some of these purposes or functions of skin as we walk through today's lecture. So what are the different regions of the skin? And I hinted at this. We've got this top layer that you're going to learn about in lab if you haven't already. It's Wednesday, so some of you already had lab. End of the day Wednesday. So we've had 2 days of lab already, yesterday and today. We have the epidermis, the top layer. We have the dermis, which is deep to the epidermis. The interface of that is this squiggly line. We've been looking at squiggly lines in the past. We looked at squiggly lines, we looked at like elastin fibers. But it actually kind of forms sort of this tongue and groove fit between the epidermis and the dermis. And that interface is referred to as red pegs. Derma papilla come up from the dermis, and the red peg comes down from the epidermis, and it kind of forms a lock, if you will. Which makes sense. You don't want your skin to like just slough off. And in some disease states, that's exactly what happens. And would it surprise you if I told you as you get older, the amount of red peg derma papilla interaction diminishes? You have fewer of them. They're not as aggressive. They're shallower. And so there is more propensity for wounding in geriatric or older skin. Okay, then we have this area referred to as the hypodermis. There's this big white space between dermis and hypodermis. To emphasize this point, on the exam, the hypodermis is not technically considered part of the skin. It's beneath the organ, adjacent to, but it's not technically part of the skin. There's two main tissues in skin, epidermis and dermis. The epidermis that we're going to look at today is keratinized squamous epithelium of the stratified variety. So stratified, keratinized squamous epithelium. That should all make sense based upon the tissues that we just got done studying. The dermis is made up of areolar connective tissue and dense irregular connective tissue. So areolar is more open, airy, open architecture. And dense irregular connective tissue is dense, as the name would imply, and the irregularity tells you what about its strength capabilities? Strong strength everywhere in multiple planes. Your skin is extremely strong. Couple of functions of skin. Communication. What? How could you communicate with your neighbor just interacting skin to skin? You could flick their earlobe, right? That's more visual, but I'm with you. You could tap them on the shoulder, right? Get their attention, pat them on the back. So there is some communication that take place. There's some communication also with the external environment. You know, your skin will give you cues. It'll communicate to you if you forgot to put your pants on, right? You're like, oh, I think I forgot something. Or your shoes, or your shirt, or if you're cold, it'll communicate because it's sensing the outside environment. It's also a site of waste secretion in the form of sweat. And that's really what sweat is waste being excreted from the body. It also forms a protective barrier, which is probably the most obvious. Protection in the form of prevention of substances from entering the skin, like foreign objects or bacterium. The bacteria that colonizes the skin stays on the surface. It doesn't actually penetrate. One example that all of us have on our skin is Staph aureus. That's a bacterial strain. How many of you have heard of a staph infection? Okay, you're like, ooh, that sounds nasty. How'd they get that? Well, Staph aureus lives on your skin. But if you have a breach in the skin and it's open for a long period of time, the colony of bacteria can overgrow and take over the wound site, and now that's a Staph aureus or a staph infection. Okay? So protection, keeping Staph aureus out, and the other 999 different bacterium that make up you. Antimicrobial soaps. So this is not to indicate that washing your hands is a bad idea. Do not take that away. What I want to talk about is in the 90s and the 2000s that actually led up to kind of the COVID epidemic, there was this huge push on hand washing. You might have remembered this. It was way before COVID, way before like hand sanitizers were everywhere. But this is when you started seeing like hand sanitizer, pump stations like in hospitals in the hallway or in the grocery store. I mean, COVID had just exploded, right? And you couldn't even find any hand sani, right? So there was actually a big marketing push by a lot of companies to produce what are called antimicrobial soaps that actually have an antimicrobial agent in them. Like a silver chlorhexidine, different types of antimicrobials. They're known antimicrobials. Those soaps cost a little bit more money. So the Center for Disease Control actually did a controlled study comparing hand washing between regular soap and antimicrobial soap. What do you think they discovered? They did the exact same thing. Hand washing is really valuable, okay? But you don't have to go and buy some fancy Procter & Gamble labeled antimicrobial soap. Okay? So what soap does is it disrupts the bacterial extracellular matrix that it lives in, ruptures the membrane, therefore the bacterium die. You don't necessarily need some fancy expensive antimicrobial soap. If you don't have it, you hand wash, it's just as good. Another function, thermoregulation. Okay, pause. Yeah, question.
Sorry, I had kind of off-topic question. I heard that hand sanitizer is bad for you just because there's alcohol in it, and when you put it in your skin, it messes with your thyroid gland or something like that. Is that true?
So I don't know about any data on the thyroid gland, but what I will say is, especially in the Southwest, because we have very dry, arid temperatures or climate rather, the skin gets dried out pretty quickly. We're not in a very humid environment. So when you add that with an alcohol-based or an ethanol-based hand sanitizer, it tends to dry out the skin excessively, and then you get cracks. And then if those cracks persist, you can actually get infections. So they can be counterproductive or contraindicated. I haven't heard any conspiracy theories on the thyroid that I've found of any merit, but you can over hand wash, you can over hand sanitize. I think we tend to err on the side of washing a lot, which is probably good. But then, of course, what's the first thing that you do when your hands are dry? You put lotion on, right? There's a lot of environments in the world where you don't even need to do that. You don't have to moisturize the skin because it does it. We'll talk about it. It does it naturally. But that's probably the number one side effect of overwashing or even using hand sanitizers, which are alcohol-based. They'll dry out the skin. So thermoregulation, another function of skin. So the picture here is showing the two layers, the epidermis on top and the deep layer is the dermis. And you can see that the epidermis is avascular. We talked about that in the last unit. No vessels. All of the vessels are located in the dermis, and it's diffusion that feeds the neighboring cells in the epidermis. Oxygen diffusion. And as the cells get further away from the blood supply, they actually die. And they become denucleated, they lose all their organelles. So the very top layer of your skin is dead because it's too far away from the blood supply to stay alive, which is actually what you want, because you want them to spit out their organelles, flatten, and become squamous in nature, and then stratify and make this nice avascular dead layer that's kind of like your armor. Okay? So this principle of being a diffusion distance away means that this is a highly vascularized tissue, the dermis. And so if you are warm, you can vasodilate, which is a word that means make bigger. Vasodilate these vessels, make them larger, pump more warm blood from the core to the surface of the skin, and allow for radiant heat loss. Now the skin, if you're fair-skinned, will become flush or quite pink, right? It's warm to touch after exercise. You see this in the wintertime here when you go for a run. You'll see a lot of flushed skin because of the vasodilation of the dermis as you're trying to bring blood to the surface of the skin and radiant heat loss as much of the heat as you can. The opposite is true. When you're cold, what do you do with those blood vessels? You vasoconstrict them to the dermis. You conserve the warm blood in the core, primarily in the thoracic and abdominal cavities where your key organs are. The skin is cold to touch. It might turn blue, right? You're preserving that heat so it doesn't get lost. So the skin is this huge thermoregulatory organ. There are some metabolic functions of skin as well. These metabolic functions, here's an en face picture in the upper right. En face means like the face, so you're looking right down at the surface. And it kind of looks like, I think looks like eggs or fried eggs. You know, it kind of looks like a barrier or a pebble driveway, if you will. So the skin itself actually has within it 7-dehydrocholesterol located in the skin. It's an early precursor to cholesterol. The skin receives energy in the form of ultraviolet light. It hits that 7-dehydrocholesterol, and it actually converts it from this sort of green format to this orange format, which is cholecalciferol, which is vitamin D3. So cholesterol in the skin, sunlight hits it, it turns it into vitamin D3. It moves to the liver and becomes calcidiol, and then it goes to the kidneys and becomes calcitriol. Calcitriol is another word for vitamin D. In fact, it's the active form of vitamin D. If you look at your vitamin bottle and you see calcitriol, it oftentimes in parentheses says vitamin D. What is vitamin D good for? What is it used for in the body? As an enzyme. Bone health, absolutely. It's labeled as a bone health supplement. It encourages the absorption of calcium in the gut. It prevents the excretion of calcium in the urine. So you don't lose the calcium and you absorb it out of your diet. And then it deposits in the bones. And that's how it's good for bone health. So the skin is intimately connected to the bones. Now you have to remember, we're going to go through all these systems, right? We're talking about skin as our first system. Physiologic system, the integument. Then we're going to talk about the skeletal system, or bones. Then we're going to move into muscle. We'll talk about the nervous system. We'll talk about special senses. Does the body care what you label the system? Does it have some like border zone of you are now leaving the integument? Welcome to Colorado, right? Welcome to the bone system. Like there is no delineation in the body. Everything talks to each other. We put it in these buckets because it's easy to write test questions about it and write books where we have chapters on the skin. And then we move to the next chapter on the skeletal system. But right here, I'm showing you how the skin and the skeletal system are connected. So let me repeat. 7-dehydrocholesterol, cholesterol, another name for it, found in the skin. How do you know that? Well, you know because your grandfather says like, well, I don't eat the skin on my chicken because it's got too much cholesterol in it. That's true. So your skin has cholesterol in it. UV light, which is energy, when you're out in the sun, it hits the cholesterol, converts it to a precursor of vitamin D, vitamin D3. Then the kidneys take it and convert it to vitamin D, the active form, calcitriol. That is used by the body to absorb calcium into your bones, keep you from losing it in the urine, depositing it into the bones. And so this is a huge function of the skin. And why we tell our older patients that wrestle with bone disease like osteoporosis, move to a sunny place, right? That's why a lot of elderly move to sunny environments. Well, they like warm weather too, but it's actually really good for their bones. Okay, so what does the hypodermis do, even though it's not part of the skin technically? Well, it allows for movement because there's this loose connection that takes place. The hypodermis is mostly fat, adipose tissue, with a high concentration of adipocytes. So it creates insulation for us, energy reserves that's throughout the subcutaneous environment. So it's readily available no matter where we are. It's not necessarily present everywhere, and it's in higher concentrations based upon sex differences. So you can kind of see kind of the distribution of fat male versus female. But it is, again, not technically considered part of the skin. Let me propose this question. The skin consists of the epidermis and the dermis. So why do you think we deliver through hypodermic needles to the hypodermis rather than in the epidermis or in the dermis? Talk it over real quick. Hypodermic needle. All right, any ideas? Why is the strategy to deliver to the hypodermis? Injections. In the very back. It's extremely well vascularized. That's right. So the uptake into the hypodermis is going to be much faster than into the epidermis, which is avascular. It'll eventually percolate down through diffusion. But even to the dermis, the hypodermis is much more vascularized than the dermis. There's also more nerve endings in the dermis, so it can be a little bit more painful. So the hypodermis is a highly sought after injection site for the delivery of drugs, pharmaceuticals, vaccines. The other big one is IM, or intramuscular. And again, muscle is very well vascularized as well. And those are the two reasons you go into those two locations. Okay, questions before I move on? We're going to break down epidermis and dermis today. We're going to talk about the two different types of skin. There's a lot of overlap between lab and lecture here. I don't think that's a bad thing. It just helps reinforce the topics. It's nice that we're paralleling each other. I mean, again, we'll kind of get away from each other for a little bit, lab and lecture, and then we'll kind of come back. But this week, we're right in lockstep. So thin versus thick skin. Thin skin is about 75 to 150 microns thick, and most of the body is consisting of thin skin. Thin skin really only has 4 layers. It's missing 1 layer. Does anybody remember which layer it's missing? Which layer is thin skin missing? Well, they're both absent of hypodermis because it's not part of the skin, so that's correct. There's 5 layers of skin in thick skin. There's only 4 layers in thin, and we'll get to all 5. The thin skin is missing the stratum lucidum layer. We'll talk about that here in a second. So, thick skin is found on the palms and the soles of the feet. There may be some other areas in the body where there's maybe a lot of abrasion. If you play a sport or you're an athlete or you're a laborer and either you wear equipment or you use equipment, because the thick skin on the hands, palms and soles of your hands, soles of your feet is thicker with all 5 layers, including that stratum lucidum layer, to give a little extra layer of protection, because you have more forces that are happening there. Thick skin, in contrast to thin skin, is about 400 to 600 microns thick. So we're just going to look at kind of the comparison between the two and then walk through the different layers like you would do in lab. So here you can see them against each other side by side and hopefully appreciate that, thick skin is much thicker than thin skin. If we take the color out, in these classes with histology, I do like to remind people, you can look at histology without the color. You can look at it in black and white. In fact, I know this is like one of these old people sayings, but years ago in the literature, we didn't publish in color. We would only publish in black and white. It was really expensive to publish in color when color became available. And so you would maybe pick one figure that you couldn't represent in a black and white figure. Okay, so like if you had a graph, you wouldn't make it like blue, green, yellow, red. You would say like open, this one's white, this one's black, this one has hatches, this one has like diagonals. Does that make sense? So if you look at older published literature, you'll see that the images are more about the architecture and about the information, not about this color appreciation that we've become so accustomed to. Okay, so we're going to look at both. We're going to look at a colored image, a pseudo-colored image to highlight the different areas that I'm trying to point out, and then I'm going to take the color out and show you the black and white. So stratum basale, we're going from deep to superficial. So someone remind us, what's deep versus superficial? Okay, instead of using skin, because I want to talk about superficial and deep with skin, I agree with you, but could you substitute with a different word? Superficial is towards the epidermis or towards the surface, and then deep would be towards the blood or the hypodermis. Okay, you with me? So if we're starting deep at the epidermis, we're right at the barrier between the epidermis and the dermis. That's the first layer. The first layer, the stratum basale layer. Closest to the blood supply. This is considered the regenerative layer of skin. This is where all skin cells arise from, the stratum basale. Basale meaning basement, like the beginning, the basement layer. You have keratinocytes that make keratin. Keratin is the main protein that gives the strength and integrity to hair, nails, and skin to some extent. Melanocytes that make melanin. We'll talk about that a little bit more. We already alluded to that earlier in the semester. and then what we refer to as Merkel discs. And the Merkel discs are sensory receptors. They're tactile discs. They're sensitive to pressure and touch. It's how you communicate with this outside environment. It's how you know you forgot to wear your watch or someone taps you on the shoulder. There are pressure sensors in the skin, like Merkel discs, that give you tactile sensation. So in yellow is this stratum basale layer. It's this transition zone between the dermis, which is more open, and the epidermis, which is more compact with cells. And hopefully you can kind of appreciate this dermal papilla coming up and the red A peg coming down. And that's that sort of interlocking finger or, lock and key kind of system that gives it its strength. So let's just take out the yellow for a second and look at the black and white. Can you appreciate this faint row of cells, the stratum basale? Okay, moving deep to superficial. Stratum spinosum. Stratum spinosum. These are all Latin words. Stratum spinosum. So the stratum spinosum layer, it's called spinosum because the cells appear spiny, or spinos is the root word, when they're prepared on a slide prep. So they kind of shrink up a little bit, this layer. And when early microscopists were looking at skin, they noticed that this layer had this spiny appearance. The other thing is we find dendritic cells here. Dendritic cells, I mentioned earlier in the semester, these are an immune cell. It's like a sentinel cell that looks out for foreign invaders. So if a bacterial cell gets through the skin, the dendritic cells might interact with it at this layer of the stratum spinosum before it makes it to the dermis, before it makes it to the hypodermis, before it makes it to a blood supply. That should make sense, right? Let's cut it off before it makes it to a main road where it can distribute throughout the entire body. They're called dendritic cells. They have a dendritic-like appearance. That's where they get their name, but they have nothing to do with the neuron. So that's a confusing nomenclature. We have some turnover here. These cells are nucleated. You can appreciate the nuclei in here. They still have these dots in them, the nucleus. If we take the color out, this is the layer just superficial to the stratum basale. So there's cell division that's still happening here. Not as much as what happens in the stratum basale layer, but still to some level, there's cell division going on. Stratum granulosum is our next superficial layer. The stratum granulosum layer has, as the name would imply, a granular-like appearance. It's about 3 to 5 cell layers thick. It has lipid-filled vacuoles that exocytose, that's that word we learned early on. That means that they expel a waterproofing agent onto the outside of the skin. And this helps to keep water in to the skin so you don't lose the valuable 50 to 75% water that you have. It also is what creates that actual barrier between the inside and the outside environment, is this stratum granulosum. Here, the organelles are starting to disintegrate or be dissolved and go away. We're getting further and further away from the dermis, where there's a blood supply. And as we approach that threshold, that diffusion limit of oxygen, the cells no longer live. So they start packing up their organelles and they dissolve them, and they're going to lose all of their organelles in the next layer. But the stratum granulosum is the last layer that actually has any remnants of organelles. The stratum granulosum with the color taken out, just so you can kind of appreciate where we are. The easiest way to recognize this, in my opinion, is this next layer. We'll talk about it, the stratum lucidum, only found in thick skin. The granulosum is just deep to that. So stratum lucidum, only present in thick skin. You have no nuclei, no cellular organelles here. The cell layer is actually translucent. You can see through it at this layer. So lucidum, where does that root Latin word come from? Where is it derived? Any takers? Lucidum. What does it mean? Lucid. Lucifer was the angel of light. Lucid means light. This is the light layer. That's what it was named. Okay? That's how you remember it. So stratum lucidum means light layer. It's a completely keratinized layer, only present in thick skin. It's easy to pick out even when you take out the color because it's the first translucent layer. These layers above are going to be translucent too, but this is the first one that shows up that's only present in thick skin. If you have a callus on your hands or your feet, if you're a dancer or you work out a lot, you have calluses, that stratum lucidum layer is what becomes thicker and thicker and thicker, along with the stratum corneum, which is the outer layer. But this is the layer that sloughs off. So as you move from deep to superficial, you start losing organelles and you slough off these cells. The term of exfoliation means to remove the cells, exfoliate. The stratum corneum is very, very tightly packed keratin, about 30 layers thick on average of dead keratinized cells. It sheds constantly. The turnover is 4 to 6 weeks for skin, depending upon your age. Probably right about 5 weeks for this classroom on average. Older patients could take upwards of 12 weeks for skin to turn over. Color taken out of the stratum corneum, probably one of the easiest tissues to identify, the stratum corneum. We saw a picture of this on the exam, right? Picture of skin. So here they are kind of put all together. Pseudo-colored on your right, all the different layers, just an H&E or hematoxylin ecin stain section. You're saying it's not black and white, Keller. It's not, but it's not pseudo-colored. In lab, this is kind of the example that you would see in lab, is something like that. Okay, questions, comments? Okay, let's talk a little bit about skin color. Let's go back to that topic. So I want you to kind of discuss with a partner, why do you think there are differences physiologically, functionally, in skin color? Okay. Any volunteers? Any ideas? Because of the melanin. Yeah, absolutely. That's probably why it exists. What's the purpose? Any ideas on purpose? UV protection. Brilliant. Either you all are reading ahead, or really, really smart, or a little bit of both, which is great. So remember this just a few slides back. We're talking about manufacturing vitamin D and UV light. So melanin made by melanocytes is a natural UV SPF. It blocks the harmful effects of too much ultraviolet light. Because too much ultraviolet light, too much sun in a fair complected individual will lead to what? A sunburn initially, and then repetitively, right? You know, I told my 5-year-old the same thing. You're going to get cancer tomorrow. Put some sunscreen on, damn it. Yeah. No, that's overacting, Dad. That's not true, but the spirit of it's true, right? Like too much of that damage and trauma leads to disease. So if you have individuals that are indigenous people that are further away from the equatorial plane, then there's less and less sunlight on a per annum basis, right? So the need for indigenous individuals that are further away from the equator, where there's more sunlight, to have more melanin is less valuable, because the balance is you don't want to block too much UV light and then not have enough vitamin D production and have weak bones. So that's sort of the balance. Now, in today's world, we move all over the place, right? But from an origin standpoint, it's kind of fascinating to see where these indigenous folks have come from and where that skin adaptation is what it is, or evolution of skin that's taken place in humanity for many, many, many years. Okay. Questions on integument. Melanocytes reside in the epidermis, not in the dermis. So we're shifting gears now to the dermis for the remaining time that we have. Let's talk about the characteristics of the dermis. Strong, flexible, mostly dense, irregular connective tissue. And I say mostly dense, irregular connective tissue, you immediately think of what characteristic that provides to this tissue. Dense, irregular connective tissue. What does it do for us? Strong, stretches in one direction, in all directions. Okay, so again, careful, if you think about it, you've actually just learned stuff, right? You didn't just take an exam, you actually remembered stuff, you're learning stuff. You're connecting the anatomical architecture to the physiologic function now. And that motif will exist throughout this semester and next semester for you. The dermis, it's made up of many, many cells, but it's made up of more matrix, right? Because it's a connective tissue. But it has cells and molecules like collagen fibers, elastin fibers, reticular fibers, fibroblasts that live inside of those are cells, and macrophages. Macrophages are a scavenger type cell that phagocytoses debris, damaged or diseased tissue in the form of an inflammatory reaction. Highly, highly vascularized. We've talked about that. You could deliver an injection into the dermis, but unfortunately, we have a lot of nerve endings. We have a lot of sensory receptors, so it's less painful to push that needle a little further and deliver the bolus into the hypodermis. And a lot of the discomfort that you feel with a dermal injection is pressure. You put the needle in and you're creating pressure in a space that's tightly packed. If you do that in the fat, it actually expands and accommodates it better. So, the better nurses, for those of you that are going that direction, the better nurses will deliver into the hypodermis in patients and not into the dermis, which is a lot more uncomfortable. And I say that as an aging individual because many of you will probably be taking care of people like me. What's the purpose of the dermis, right? Blood supply, perfusion of not just the dermis, but by extension, diffusion of oxygen into the epidermis, sensory perception, and structural integrity. Allows the organ to stay intact and function the way it's supposed to. So this slide nicely kind of carves out our reticular layer, which is more deep, than our papillary layer, which is part of what makes up that dermal papilla. Those are those extensions that kind of stick up, right? And then you can see the epithelium or the epidermis that's up on top. So here's a prep of skin that gives you this sort of appreciation of these different papillary layer that's closest to the dermal papilla, which are these extensions that poke up into the epidermis. This is your papillary layer. And then down here, can you appreciate that this is dense, irregular connective tissue? That's the reticular layer. And it's almost beautiful. Like you're like, wow, that is like totally dense, irregular connective tissue. Right here, it totally transitions into a completely different tissue right here. Another prep, it's a beautiful stain that allows you to see, kind of this area of this dermal papilla, your dense, irregular connective tissue with a much darker hematoxylin stain. And here's your areolar tissue that makes up the papillary layer. We take out the color, just so you can kind of see if you can tell the difference. Pretty obvious. Should help you identify things in lab. Okay, other than areolar tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, blood vessels, what else do we find in the dermis? What are some other things that are found there? Well, we've got hair follicles. We've got hair follicles that, that first SEM picture, scanning electron micrograph picture on the introductory slide, where you were correctly identifying a hair shaft coming out of a pore. That epidermis actually dives down into the hair shaft, so you have that protection all the way down. So you can see where histologically the root of the hair is in the dermis and it extends out into the epidermis. So the hair bulb in the dermis extending all the way out, the shaft exiting out of the epidermis. There are accessory structures that are associated with it, like sweat glands. You've got apical sweat glands right here. These apical sweat glands will release substances onto the shaft of the hair, and out of this pore is where sweat will evacuate. We've already talked about the nerves and the blood vessels, but for sake of completeness, you can kind of appreciate that interface of the nerve ending near the the blood supply, not the nerve ending, but the blood supply coming from the adipose tissue that's deep and entering into right where the hair bulb is to supply it with a blood supply, giving it oxygen and nutrition to deliver a hair growth cycle. So we'll talk a little bit more about accessory structures on Monday, but I wanted to emphasize them here, or at least introduce them here, because they're captured in the dermis. So we talked about epidermis and dermis today. And we'll come back on Monday and we'll talk about more things about hair and accessory structures, and then we'll get into some clinical correlations or applications on Monday's lecture. But before we wind up for today, a couple of review questions. Where do keratinocytes first appear in the epidermis? And then which stratum is the first to contain dying or dead cells? So it's kind of two questions here as a review. Think about it, and I'll ask for a volunteer. Keratinocytes first appear where? Which stratum is the first to contain dead or dying cells? Guesses? C? It is, there are dead cells in C. That's the stratum corneum, but it's not the first layer that sees them. What's the first layer that sees them? The very back? Stratum granulosum. They're still present. The nuclei are still present. They're starting to pack things up. So it'd be one layer superficial to the stratum granulosum, which is stratum lucidum. Stratum lucidum. Okay, makes sense? Okay, next question. Which one's the papillary layer, and which one is, and what's it made of? Sorry, which one's the papillary layer? 1, 2, or 3, and what's it made of? Two is the papillary layer. I would agree. What's it made up of? You have dense irregular or you have areolar as options? Areolar. Thank you. Nicely done. Questions? Comments? Any concern? Okay, comment.
I know that the hypodermis isn't a part of the skin, but does it still count as part of the whole system, or is it not part of the integument?
Yeah, so it's a great question. He started out with saying, I know you said that it's not technically part of the skin, the hypodermis, but is it considered part of the whole system as the integument? So the answer to that would be no, especially on the exam. Just know the category is the epidermis and the dermis are the integument, and the hypodermis is outside of that. Okay? It obviously interacts and interfaces with it, but you'll see that happening a lot in the body. Question in the back? Well, it does have multiple organs. So the question is, I thought organ systems had to have multiple organs. It's a great question. So we're emphasizing epidermis and dermis, but so for example, the sweat gland is an organ. And we'll get into that in more detail, right? And these receptors, many of the receptors that are more sophisticated, like a Pacinian corpuscle or a Rufian corpuscle or a Meissner corpuscle, they're actually an organ themselves as well. Multiple tissues making up, serving different purposes. They have connective tissue, they have nerve tissue. So it's a very astute question, potential criticism of, presenting it in this way, because we haven't presented the whole thing yet. But really, really good question. So skin isn't just made up of epidermis and dermis. It's made up of all these accessory tissues too that we haven't really covered. We kind of brushed on it a little bit here at the end, where we talked about, the erector pili, which I think I failed to mention. These erector pili are muscles that actually innervate or insert onto the hair, like right here, this erector pili or piloerector muscle. There's two names for it. And this controls if the hairs lay down or if they stand up. So taken together, you have nerves, you have sweat glands, you have erector pili, you have epidermis, you have dermis. All of this makes up the organ system of the integument. Okay? Yes? Yeah, that's what gives rise to goosebumps, is when they contract. Yep. Again, we'll cover more of these accessory structures Monday. We're just introducing kind of the integument, slow rolling this week. But if you can read chapter 5, you don't have a quiz, you can work ahead. You could do chapter 5 quiz if you want. But please come prepared on Monday. We'll finish out integument, talk about some of these other structures, and we'll get into some clinical examples. All right, have a great weekend.